a lot of so-called sustainability-oriented businesses were focused on issues that were relevant to their affluent customers, such as the environmental impact, and not thinking about low-income members of society. So those issues of economic justice and racial justice have been brought to the fore, which I think is good.
This is the CMO and Joe podcast. We interview today's most inspiring chief marketing officers and savvy marketers of lucrative direct-to-consumer e-commerce companies, bringing you insightful stories and tips on marketing, sales, branding, and much more. We bring you the best lessons from the best. Let's get started with your host, Joe Momoh.
Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
I'm super excited to have you on the podcast. You have a wealth of experience in the nonprofit and for-profit industries, along with e-commerce and marketing and business strategy. So it's going to be a fun conversation, I think. But before we do all that, maybe perhaps give us a little bit of background of yourself, kind of your origin story.
Sure. So I started UncommonGoods back in 1999, so 21 years ago, and I had always, ever since I was a kid, dreamed of being an entrepreneur. Got out of college, thought I was going to start my own record label, but decided I'd first work for a record label, or what now is maybe called a music label, since there aren't very few vinyl records anymore. And nobody wanted to hire me, and was unemployed, living with my parents, and had a high school friend who was working in research on Wall Street. And he had encouraged me to take a look at that field. And while I was in college, had no interest in it. But when I was unemployed and living with my parents, I became a lot more interested, and ended up spending 14 years working in that field. And my job was to be a research analyst, studying trends in the retail industry and making recommendations on what stocks people should buy. So I specialized in companies like Home Depot, Best Buy, AutoZone, and others. And while I was doing that work, unrelated to the work, just through a friend of mine, I learned about the internet maybe in 1993, 94, was totally fascinated by it. And when internet retailers first came on the scene, and I'm guessing it was 95, 96, I then started to write about it as an important new channel. And after spending a couple of years doing that, I came to the conclusion that I'd much rather try to create a business than be a critic or write about other businesses, because I looked at the entrepreneurs that were starting internet businesses and said to myself, you know what, I probably know as much or as little as they do. It was a brand new world, and this new frontier, and nobody was really an expert at that time. And it seemed really exciting. And so I studied the industry for a living and used that knowledge to come up with a concept that I thought could leverage the strength of the internet while not having really strong store-based competition. And somewhat by accident, I ended up at a craft show in Washington, D.C., and saw this meeting of buyers and sellers at the Smithsonian Craft Show, and realized what an inefficient market it was and how much better it could be for both buyers and sellers if that craft show were opened 24/7, 365 days a year, where you could return products you didn't want. The store was always there. It wasn't just on a weekend in April. And so that was when I decided to take the plunge. That was April of 1999. I had to give 3 months notice to my employer, and then I was on my way.
Wow, that's amazing. I think it's also important to note that UncommonGoods is a B Corporation. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, we're a founding B Corporation from 2007. Yeah.
That's awesome. Maybe give a little bit of background to what that means for the listeners that don't really know too much about that.
Sure. I would say it's kind of a funny story. I was at a trade show once in the early days of the company, and one of the vendors who was pitching their product had a big banner up that said, "We donate 10% of our profits." And so I asked the vendor how much money they had donated the prior year. And she told me, well, actually her business was unprofitable, so they didn't make any contribution. But if I ordered from them, they might help become profitable, and then they donate money. And to me, that was indicative of the problem with, some people call it greenwashing, but lots of folks who claim to be socially responsible, but maybe their actions don't back up their words. And the idea of B corporations are essentially a good housekeeping seal of approval, where you're effectively audited for your environmental and social responsibility claims, and are evaluated every 3 years on issues like diversity within your organization, pay, what does the highest paid person make relative to the lowest paid person? Do you pay a living wage? What are the demographics of your leadership team? What's your environmental footprint? All of those types of issues and questions. And the main concept is that a business should not only be focused on making money, you should also be focused on people and the planet. You have lots of incredibly successful business people financially who leave environmental and social carnage in their wake, and then in their waning days on the planet, they say, oh, let me name these buildings after me and donate all this money. And my view, and I think the view of B corporations, is to truly be sustainable, make your business responsible for its environmental and social impact.
Absolutely. No, I love that, David. I don't think it has to be mutually exclusive to have a profitable business, and also one that positively affects the people and the planet, and have sustainable practices as well. But my question would be, what's kind of the biggest thing that Uncommon Goods does that maybe consumers don't know about?
I would say advocacy around workers' rights. So we have been very active, particularly in New York State. I worked for a number of years on a national level and found that it was very difficult to get changes made in the law, but within New York State, much easier. So 2 issues related to the workplace that we were really active in and I think impactful were, number one, getting the minimum wage raised in New York State, and as important to me, having it, number one, different in different parts of the state. So in higher cost parts of New York State, you have a higher wage, whereas prior to that, it was the same whether you were in New York City or in a rural Adirondack community, which makes no sense. And the second thing that was changed was indexing it to inflation. And so at least for a number of years, the minimum wage was rising with inflation, at least in some parts of the state. That has not been fully implemented, and now it's flat at 15 in New York City. And so my hope is that change will happen as well. But I would say that's something that we're less known for. Effective September 1, we pay a starting wage of $18 an hour for our warehouse workers. And we have our whole operation under one roof, which in New York City, which is pretty uncommon.
Absolutely. To switch gears a little bit, Dave, you mentioned New York City, and that's kind of been the hub for the last 100 days with the pandemic and the protests and all that. But for you personally, what's kind of been the biggest struggle or challenge for you the last, say, 3 or 4 months?
So I'd say there have been 2 major challenges. One is, as you said, we were the epicenter of the pandemic back in March, and we shipped 80% of our inventoried product, typically out of Brooklyn. And we had some team members getting sick. Nobody had tested positive for COVID. And I had to decide whether or not to keep our warehouse open. We shut our office down because everybody could work remotely if they were working on a computer. But if you're physically picking and packing orders, you can't do that from home. And so I made the difficult decision in March to actually shut down our warehouse. And we had it closed pretty much for 3 months. And we transferred inventory to other partner warehouses that we work with, one in the Midwest and one on the West Coast. But we gave up about 2/3 of our assortment, 2/3 of the product that we sell was not available for sale until pretty much late July from March. And so that was a tough decision to make, but it was one where I wanted to focus on the health and safety of our team members first. And so that was very difficult decision to make. We've never done that before. We stayed up and operational during 9/11. But this was just something where, we have people living in multi-generational homes, and I did not, even if, our team member was not high risk, we had a number of folks whose spouses or parents or grandparents were high risk and just did not want to take that chance. So that was one issue. I would say the second issue, you mentioned the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and that's also been a difficult issue in that we've been very involved as a company, as I mentioned earlier, in policy issues that relate to the workplace. However, with the Black Lives Matter movement and racial justice, we were getting asked to get involved in areas that impact the workplace and also broader society. And that was something I felt unqualified for, and honestly pretty uncomfortable wading into politics. I've always wanted to have a big tent at Uncommon Goods. I believe in economic and social justice, but I also believe that we should have Democrats, Republicans, what have you, be open to whomever working at the company. So that was a tricky issue to navigate. I spent and continue to spend an enormous amount of time on the issue, learning and relearning. I thought I had a pretty aware and progressive mindset, and there was a ton that I didn't know and that I don't know, and realized that there's a heck of a lot more that we can do. And one of the things I've really tried to do is focus on things we can control. So, if we're supporters of paid family leave, we're supporters of a higher minimum wage, let's make sure we walk the walk. Similarly, as it relates to racial justice, we took a look at our assortment, and only about 1% of our vendors were Black-owned businesses, which is unacceptable. And I could make excuses. Hey, we go to the trade shows, we look at products that are submitted to us, and we're not discriminating. That's what's coming in, okay? That's who we see at the trade show. But the awareness that I gained from thinking a lot and reading a lot and listening to a lot over the past few months was that's not enough. That's not how you create a just society. That's not how you level a playing field. And this is not lowering the bar in any way. Our customers will keep us honest on, is this product compelling? But we've got to perhaps work a little harder to find the Black-owned vendors. And if we do that, those are going to be uncommon goods, okay? It's harder for us to find. It's harder for anyone else to find. And if it's compelling product, it's going to sell really well, and it's going to be great for our business. And so we took a pledge middle of this year to say 10% of our new vendors for all of 2020 will be Black-owned businesses. And we're expecting to onboard 250 businesses new vendors for the year, and we've already lined up 25 Black-owned businesses and are in the process of getting their products live on the site. So that's one initiative we took on, and another one was a scholarship and internship program through the Thurgood Marshall College Fund with public colleges and universities that are historically Black. And so we're going to fund scholarships and then have those students have paid internships at UncommonGoods. So those are things that I felt we can control as a business, still have our big tent, and hopefully have a positive impact.
Absolutely. No, I love that, Dave. Control what you can control. And I love the initiatives UncommonGoods has taken with the 10% new vendors and the paid internships. Even the Intestinal Fortitude, I like to call it, to shut down the warehouse and have 2/3 of your product unavailable. That must take a lot of, again, intestinal fortitude. But for you specifically, Dave, what's kind of unique skills that's led you to become such a decisive decision maker and successful leader?
Well, first of all, it's kind of you to say that, but I don't know that I'm that decisive. I agonize a lot over decisions, and honestly, probably take too long to make a lot of decisions. But I don't know that I have any superpower. But if I did have one particular strength, I would say it's persistence. Things in general in life have not come that easy to me. A lot of what I've gotten, I've had to work really hard for. And as a result of that, I have practice in not quitting. And that's been really important in this business. This was not a instant just add water success. It took us about 6 years to really make a meaningful profit in the business. And I took no salary for the first 6 years of the business.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, a lot of our listeners are business owners or even aspiring entrepreneurs. And having you say that it's a practice of not quitting, and you're going to take your bumps in the beginning phases. And it's not a get rich quick type of scenario, that you do have to put in the work.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, though, is there are times when you should quit, okay? And, I was one of the lucky ones who was persistent, but I was seeing signs. So even though the company was losing money, our revenue was continuing to grow. Our advertising costs as a percent of sales were continuing to come down. So there was positive there was validation of the business model, or increasing signs of that. I think blind belief is dangerous, and knowing when to quit is important. So I think persistence can be a double-edged sword and can turn into stubbornness at times.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's definitely a fine line between persistence and almost delusion.
Yeah.
But like you mentioned, once you start seeing that positive business metrics going up and you're slowly trending upward, then you're onto something, and that you should just continue on your path and keep working.
Yep.
So I want to switch gears just a little bit. I want to get maybe into more tactical business, or whatever you want to call it, strategy. But for you, from your perspective, Dave, how's the industry changed from when you first started to now?
An industry defined as e-commerce or internet retail?
Exactly.
So I wouldn't quite call us outcasts or outlaws when I started back in 1999, but it was definitely the fringe, okay? And so when I told people about my idea for UncommonGoods back in 1999, I remember two lines of reasoning why it would fail. One was only men were on the internet, women were not shopping online. And number two, nobody's going to buy a product like yours, handmade products, what have you, without being able to touch and feel it. And so there was a huge amount of skepticism. One of the biggest negatives at the time was fear of credit cards, credit card numbers being stolen, fraud. And so a lot of people didn't trust the internet. Dial-up was the predominant, 56K was actually the predominant form of connectivity. You didn't have cable modems. Nobody had T1s or T3s, what have you. And so it was a very, very different world. Google didn't exist. There was no video. It was a very different world, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Very bare bones almost, if you will.
Yeah.
Where do you see the industry continuing to go? Obviously, there's so many retailers now with the advent of Shopify and other e-commerce platforms. But from your perspective, Dave, where do you see just the industry going in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
I would tell you that I honestly don't know. I think the general trends that I've seen over the last 25 years of being involved in this industry are going to continue, which there are three main drivers in retail. It's service, selection, and price. And led by Amazon, I think we'll continue to see improving service, whether it's faster delivery, more knowledgeable salespeople, automated bots that can answer your questions. I just think the service component is going to continue to improve. I think the site experience also, as part of that, you're going to continue to have faster and faster websites, richer imagery, augmented reality, things like that, I think will increasingly be part of the experience. In terms of selection, I think you've seen a lot of these so-called digitally native vertical brands. I think it's going to be easier and easier to create new brands and new stores around those brands online. I think Amazon and companies like that, these platforms with massive assortments, I think they have a place. But I also think it can lead to customer fatigue or exhaustion, just being overwhelmed by too much choice. And I think companies like ours that offer an edited assortment with a point of view will continue to succeed. And similarly on price, I think price definitely matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. I think the quality of the product, quality of the service. We offer a lifetime guarantee on everything we sell. You can return anything that you buy at Uncommon Goods, barring that it's something you customized. I think those kinds of things will continue to be important.
Absolutely. And I love how you mentioned price isn't the only deciding factor for customers. I know you're a competitive positioning expert, if you will, or have tons of experience there. And I always like to say that competing on just price is a race to the bottom. But from your experience, how do you position your brand or even business to really stand out for the competition? Because obviously with online retail, the market's becoming more and more saturated as we speak. So how do you position your brand or company to be one of those ones that stand out?
So it's really in our name and our brand promise, which is you're going to find products at Uncommon Goods that are uncommon, and hopefully you think they're good or even great. So, we're pushing close to 50% of our sales now are exclusive products, things you can only find at Uncommon Goods. And, that's a big change versus 10, 15 years ago. When we started the company, we both lacked the buying power. We didn't have an in-house design team the way we have today. And, we didn't have much in the way of competition. So exclusivity was not a focus. Today, we recognize that for the customer to shop with us, she's got to be able to find something that she's not going to find on Amazon or, for that matter, anywhere else. And so I would say that's the single biggest factor. If you look at retailing as a three-legged stool, selection, service, and price, we feel we can win on selection. On service, there are some elements where I feel we do phenomenally well, but we are not going to beat Amazon in getting a product to a customer in an hour. That's just not the battle we're going to win on. And then on price, we have to charge a fair price. We will not charge a higher price than somebody else for the identical item. But if you factor in that 65% of what we sell is made in the US, 50% is handmade, you're going to be able to find cheaper functional equivalents than what we sell. But I like to think of a lot of what we sell as functional art, and you're buying it for the aesthetic, not just the function.
Absolutely. I just wanted to step back a little bit. Obviously, you mentioned Uncommon Goods was founded in '99, and for me personally, I love the come up story and kind of the grind and the learnings you learn on the way. But for you personally, what's kind of been I hate calling it failures, but the learning opportunities that you've learned through your building of the brand and the company?
I think probably the biggest one is worry more about the customer than the competition. And what happened was, when we started the company, we had, no exaggeration, probably 30 competitors, almost all of whom were venture capital backed with multiples of the money that we had. And it felt like we were in a race. Okay. Jeff Bezos of Amazon called it a land grab, and they were sort of the leaders in this, spending billions of dollars. And we got caught up. I personally got caught up in growing the company faster, growing the size of the company and the speed at which we were moving, at a speed where I really didn't know what we were doing. Okay. And a lot of business, at least with me at the helm, is trial and error. Okay. You try something, does it work? Think about, if you're driving a car at 20 miles an hour and you take a wrong turn and you hit a telephone pole, all right, you're going to have a pretty big dent, but you're going to live to tell the tale. You're driving 100 miles an hour, you hit that pole, it's game over. And the lesson that I learned was that we have to grow at a controlled pace and make sure that we manage our cash, because that money doesn't grow on trees. The venture capitalists, or in our case, individual investors who were supportive of the company in 1999, 2000, might not be around when you next want to have a fundraise. And so we really had to slow down our growth. We actually shrank from 35 team members down to 5 team members in 2001, and really had to grind it out for a number of years after that, recognizing we had to get the formula right and learn how to make money before expanding the business.
Absolutely. What's one question, Dave, that I'm sure you get tons of interview requests and business opportunities, but what's one question that you never get asked that you wish you would be asked?
So it's a little off topic, but I read an article the other day written by Nick Kristof, and he was theorizing about 50 years from now, what will people look back at and think was just unconscionable, that was generally accepted by our society. And I would say it's the treatment of animals. So we are an reasonably animal-friendly company. We do not sell any leather, feather, or fur. We are not yet vegan, but that's a place I'd like to get us. But I think if people really focused on how animals are treated in our society, and I believe sometime in the future they will look back on the treatment of animals and feel like it's completely unacceptable.
Absolutely. I feel like there's more of a trending that way to be more aware of the environments in regards to the animals and also the actions we take on the planet.
Yeah, I think that's been true. And what I feel has been missing has been the people side of it. And I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, but yeah, animals could use a little more love too, in my opinion.
A little bit more TLC. Speaking of trends, what's kind of the most exciting marketing trend that you see right now?
I think what you were just touching on, the shoppers' increased focus on purpose and meaning in their purchases. And there's a lot of opportunity for abuse in that. But there's a lot of good that can and I think does come of that. I mean, there are companies like Patagonia whose brand, to a large extent, is built on their environmental commitment. And the fact that shoppers care about that, I think, is wonderful. So I find that really, really exciting.
Absolutely. From your perspective, though, what are kind of some of the components of a successful brand? So you mentioned Patagonia with their values and overall company values of the environment. But just from you personally, what do you think are the most successful elements of a brand?
So I think, as you were touching on before, being differentiated. Okay, there are no shortage of brands out there, and so how are you different from the rest? I think that's important. I think an element of that is consistency. So if you're different in one way today and different in another way tomorrow, it's going to be a lot harder for the customer to remember you. So I think a point of view that's distinctive and sticking with it, being consistent with that perspective.
Yeah, no, I love that consistency and even authenticity. I think those two are a deadly combination when it comes to branding. From your perspective, I'm also curious to know what's the difference between marketing and sales.
What do you mean?
How would you categorize the relationship between marketing and sales? Are they one-on-one, or are they how do you see them different from one another, if they are?
So when you say sales, because when I think of sales, I'm thinking of revenue from a customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me if I'm answering the question you're asking. I mean, to me, there are two ways to look at marketing. There's transaction-driven marketing, which is often known as sort of lower in the funnel, the consideration funnel. And then there's more branding-oriented marketing, which may be more around awareness and identity. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to get your perspective on kind of the different stages, or even just what your personal relationship you think is between marketing and sales. Yeah,
I mean, I think both are important. We as a fairly scrappy, we're 21 years old, but I still think of us as a startup. We're still independently owned and run. So we have no major corporate backers. We've got to justify all our spending. I think, if anything, we've probably erred on the side of too much focus on the equivalent of last click attribution. So an example would be if we post an ad, a display ad, somebody sees that influences the customer, but they don't go directly to our site and click on it. But then they do a Google search a few days later, and they remember Uncommon Goods from that search. And so when we show up, let's say in the paid search results, they click on that Uncommon Goods ad and then buy something. If we gave 100% of the credit to that Google ad, that's so-called last click attribution, we would be undervaluing the display ad or perhaps some branding video that we did or some PR that we did. And I think both are important. I would say when we were struggling for survival, we didn't have time for or money for branding. I would say today we're investing more in it. But I'd say as a company, we generally lean pretty heavily on a sales-oriented marketing approach.
So I'll pose a hypothetical to you then, Dave. Let's say you were given an extra 50% more budget. What type of things would you invest in and why?
Within marketing or anything?
Just anything to help build the business and brand.
Probably on the merchandising side. One of the things that we've looked at is building more or investing more in proprietary merchandise. So maybe we work with an artist and designer coming up with a product, and their strength may be design. It may not be production. Can we actually in Brooklyn create the product? And so that's something that we're looking at. And I'd say, it's also with a focus on exclusivity. If we're involved in the design and the production, I would say there's an opportunity there. So I would say that's one thing. Another would be figuring out how to get the product to the customer more quickly. Again, we're not going to beat Amazon. We're not going to try to match them with 1 hour delivery, but if we can shave a few days off delivery time, it's certainly going to please our customer.
Absolutely. We only have a couple more questions here for you, Dave. One topic I did want to touch on real quick because I know you're an expert at it, but you mentioned service, selection, and price are kind of the pillars of a successful online business. And I was curious as to know how do you create a great customer experience?
I think it starts with empathy. Both literally and figuratively put yourself in the customer's shoes and never be satisfied. Okay. Always assume the customer is right. Sometimes she's not, but if you start with that empathy and assumption that she is right, and you have a commitment starting with the CEO in pleasing that customer, I think you can get to a great experience. I remember I got a gift of a shirt from my wife from LL Bean, and I have rather bony elbows, and within no time, I had worn holes through the elbows of these flannel shirts, and it happened within a matter of months. This was not years. I didn't wear the shirt every day, and I thought, wow, that's not acceptable. So I had 2 shirts, put them in my closet because I was really busy at the time, and I was going to get in touch with LL Bean and get those shirts returned. And finally, sometime later, I was cleaning out my closet, found those shirts, took them to the office, and called LL Bean up, and they couldn't find my order. And they said, well, our records only go back 7 years. Is it possible it's older than that? And I said, I really don't think so. Well, it turns out it was something like 9 years old. And they said, do you still want to return it? And I felt kind of sheepish about it. But the customer service representative said to me, if you're not satisfied, we're not satisfied. And I said, well, truth be told, I sat on this for a long time, but I really wasn't satisfied with the quality. And she gave me a credit, and I remembered that. And, I think that kind of mindset, which is we're not happy unless the customer's happy, is a great North Star for driving your customer experience decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny how you remember kind of the, I don't want to say little things, but things like that just really resonates, and it makes you drawn to the brand and even company. So it makes you want to purchase more, buy more from them.
Hopefully. I mean, honestly, in that situation, I have not purchased a lot from LL Bean, but I still think it's the right thing to do. Because I was not an active shopper beforehand, but if I were, and I had that experience and they didn't stand behind the product, that would have been the end for me. So, you're going to get collateral damage giving money away that doesn't have an ROI. And I'd be a great example of that with LL Bean, but I think you have to do that because you're not going to be able to identify which customer is a potential long-term winner. I think you just have to have those right policies. It's sort of like a store having clean bathrooms. Some customers care, some customers don't, but you got to do it for everybody.
Absolutely. I could attest to I'm one of those customers that care.
Me too.
Only a couple more questions here, Dave. What are you proud of that maybe we haven't touched on in the interview today?
I'd say a couple things, and I don't know that I would say. I'm always worried about being proud because they say pride goeth before a fall. But two good things I would say are, number one, after 21 years, we're still an independent company. And I would say we're as true, if not more true, to our values. And that doesn't mean we're anywhere close to perfect, but I feel like we haven't sold out. We haven't really compromised on our initial values. And then also seeing a number of people within our company grow and develop, both within areas that they worked. And then we've had a number of people who have transferred departments, whether they're warehouse workers who have become software developers. But that's been really great to see as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys' values and all the social good you're doing. Where can our listeners connect with you online?
So obviously they can come check out UncommonGoods.com. They can send email to feedback@UncommonGoods, and I work to read every piece of customer feedback. I don't reply to every one. And if somebody wants to send email to me, david.bolotsky@UncommonGoods.com. But I would say I'm not big on Twitter or other social media. I got a lot of other things keeping me busy.
You got a business to run. Well, I implore our listeners to check out Uncommon Goods. Again, like I mentioned, you guys are doing great stuff. How I like to end the podcast is the guests. Obviously, this is the marketing and branding podcast. So the guests say a phrase or a word to describe their brand. So my question to you, Dave, is what's one word or phrase that you would describe Dave Bolotsky's brand?
We're all out of the ordinary.
This episode of the CMO and Joe podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more business strategies and tactics to help you create the profitable and successful business you've always dreamed of. And don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best content. See you on the next episode.